The low hum of the projection system filled the room as it spun slowly in the middle of the table. The blue-tinted map of the building glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows against the sterile walls. The map highlighted their route, drawn out in exacting detail from the basement of the main building all the way to one of the lower floors of the shortest adjacent tower. Their target was clear, a heavily fortified enemy command center at the heart of the compound. The corpsman mercenaries had set up shop in this sprawling complex, and it was Cerberus' job to tear it down. Alvarez, the team leader, stood tall and straight, his sharp eyes scanning the digital map for any anomalies. The mission was straightforward, but they all knew that nothing ever went exactly as planned in combat. His mind ran through the possible obstacles: enemy patrols, automated turrets, surprise ambushes. He mentally walked the route over and over again. He wasn't just looking at the map, he was anticipating every possible threat, considering every angle of the mission. "We move," Alvarez commanded, his voice calm but authoritative. He was a seasoned leader, someone who had seen enough combat to know when to push his team and when to hold back. Today, the push was inevitable. The rest of the squad gathered around the table, their expressions grim but resolute. Each member of Cerberus was a cog in a finely tuned machine, expertly trained, battle-hardened, and ready for whatever came next. They were a well-oiled unit, and their survival depended on how well they executed this mission. None of them spoke. The weight of the task was clear in their eyes. The tension in the room was palpable, but it wasn't the kind of tension that made the team falter. It was the kind of tension that sharpened their senses, made their bodies move on instinct. There was no room for error, not today. Everyone knew their role and what was at stake. This wasn't just a mission to them, it was personal. This was their shot at making a real difference in a war that had been dragging on for far too long. Alvarez met each of their gazes one by one. "Gear check." "Make it quick." They spread out, taking stock of their weapons and equipment. Each member of Cerberus knew that even the slightest misstep could be deadly. The sound of gear being adjusted, weapons being checked, and armor straps being tightened echoed throughout the small briefing room. There was no time for delay. Mac, the demolitions expert, checked the latches on his gear belt. He ran his fingers over the rough exterior of his LMG, making sure it was locked and loaded. He always had a calm air about him, but it wasn't a false sense of security. He knew the chaos that lay ahead. It was his job to keep the enemy pinned down, making sure Cerberus had the firepower they needed to move forward. He liked to think of himself as the hammer to Alvarez's hand. Without the right kind of support, nothing moved. Penn stood in front of a mirror, adjusting her shotgun. She was always the last to prepare, always checking her weapon in minute detail. Her focus was unmatched, her precision deadly. She never had to rush, and neither did she make unnecessary movements. Every shot she fired was intentional, every round carefully calculated. She didn't waste ammo, and she didn't miss. Her silence was often mistaken for coldness, but it wasn't indifference. It was her way of dealing with the weight of battle. Lay, the youngest, stood at the far corner, her movements hurried but controlled. Her youth gave her speed and agility, but it was the constant drive to prove herself that made her dangerous. She was new to the squad, and every mission was another opportunity to prove her worth. There was no time for mistakes, no time for doubt. She checked her submachine gun and slung it over her shoulder. Her heart was racing, but she didn't show it. In Cerberus, emotions had no place. Nurse was methodical as always, her hands moving with an almost surgical precision. Her medic's pouch was secured at her side, each item within easy reach. The rest of the squad could only do their jobs if they stayed alive, and Nurse made sure of that. But her role was more than just patching up wounds. She kept the squad together when the weight of combat threatened to pull them apart. Her steady gaze met Alvarez's, and he gave her a subtle nod. It was their silent agreement. No one was alone in this fight. "We've got one shot at this," Alvarez said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. "We do it fast, we do it clean, and we get out. No second chances." The team nodded, their expressions set in determination. This was their mission, and they weren't going to let anything stand in their way. No one spoke. They didn't need to. This was their time. The doors to the briefing room opened, and the team moved out in unison, each step purposeful. The hallways of the compound were silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural in a place designed for combat. There was no sign of enemy movement, but they all knew that could change in an instant. The sound of their boots echoed in the tight corridors, each member of the team moving with precision. Alvarez led the way, his eyes scanning the environment. He'd been in this kind of situation before, and the feeling of walking into the unknown never got any easier. He knew the stakes. He knew that every moment they spent in this building brought them closer to danger. But he didn't show it. He couldn't afford to. The rest of the team was counting on him to lead them through. Penn was just behind him, her movements almost as fluid as his. Her focus was entirely on the mission, and she didn't let anything distract her. Her eyes flicked from one shadowed corner to the next, alert for any signs of movement. Her shotgun was cradled in her arms, ready to fire at a moment's notice. Behind them, Mac kept his hand on the grip of his LMG, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. His pace was deliberate, always a step behind, but never far from the action. He was the last line of defense if things went sideways. And they often did. Lay moved quickly, scanning every doorway and hallway with the urgency of someone trying to prove themselves. She wasn't just moving for the mission, she was moving for her place in Cerberus, for the respect she hadn't earned yet. But with each step, she was getting closer to being part of something bigger than herself. The weight of the task ahead pressed down on her, but she never faltered. Nurse was last, her calm demeanor providing a sense of stability to the group. She was always at the rear, keeping an eye on the others, making sure no one was left behind. She moved with the quiet confidence that came from years of experience. She wasn't just a medic, she was the glue that held the team together, both in battle and out of it. Without her, the squad would crumble under the weight of their own wounds, both physical and emotional. They reached the first intersection. Alvarez's fist came up, signaling the team to halt. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the corridor. His ears caught the faintest sound, a low, mechanical hum. A sentinel. He was sure of it. He knew the sound of their footsteps, knew the subtle nuances of the machines they fought against. The sentinel was waiting just around the corner, a silent predator ready to strike. "Pen," Alvarez said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension. 30 meters to the door. "Ready?" Pen didn't need any more instruction. She knew what to do. She adjusted her grip on the shotgun and took her place at the corner. Alvarez stepped back against the far wall, giving her the space she needed to work. It was a practice dance they had perfected over countless missions. When one moved, the other followed, each knowing their role without question. Pen took a deep breath, centering herself. She didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, she launched the grenade around the corner, timing it perfectly. The explosive detonated just as she spun into action, her shotgun raised and ready. The sentinel was already recovering from the blast, its mechanical limbs jerking in an attempt to shield its vulnerable spots. It was slow. It was disoriented. Crack. The first round tore into the sentinel's right hip joint. The machine staggered, its movement stuttered for a moment. Before it could regain control, Pen fired again. Crack. The second slug slammed into the sentinel's faceplate, tearing through the thin armor and burrowing deep inside. Sparks flew as the machine's head exploded, its body jerking backwards and collapsing against the wall. Pen didn't pause. She had one task: to eliminate the threat. The rest of Cerberus surged forward, guns raised and ready. Mac opened fire with his LMG, sending suppressive rounds down the hallway as Alvarez led the others toward cover. They had done it. They had taken down the first major obstacle. But they all knew it wouldn't be long before more were on the way. They pushed further into the building, their movements deliberate and coordinated. The resistance was tougher than they had anticipated, but Cerberus slowly cut through it. They had expected a fight, but they weren't prepared for the intensity of the opposition. The Corpsman mercenaries had been prepared. They had planned for this moment. And yet, despite the odds, Cerberus continued to push forward, cutting down enemy soldiers and traps with precision. The path wasn't easy, but it was manageable. And with every step they took deeper into the compound, the sense of purpose burned stronger in their chests. They had one mission: to stop the Corpsmen and their plans. And they wouldn't stop until it was done.